The morning the market laughed loudest. The ragged stranger only lowered his eyes. His bicycle chain hung broken in his hand. Nobody offered him water. Nobody offered him a stool. Then a thin girl with a cracked clay pot crossed the mud toward him. The other traders hissed her name like a curse. Adaizi did not stop. She knelt in front of the stranger. From her stall, the proud Chinyere watched and curled her lip. Mama Nkechi struck her cane on a basket. A poor girl wasting good water on a poor man. They sneered, fit for each other. What none of them knew was what waited in a locked cedar chest 2 villages away. Folded in red cloth lay coral beads, a lion cloth, the regalia of a crown prince. Adaize pressed the cool pot into the stranger's hands and told him gently to drink. She could not have known her small mercy had just chosen a queen. The square of Umuokwe village was loud that morning with bargaining and dust. Goats nosed at spilled cassava. Women called their prices over each other's heads. And in the middle of it, the stranger stood like a man who had wandered out of a harder world. His sandals worn through at the toe, his shirt the color of old ash. He had pushed the broken bicycle 3 miles before dawn. The chain had snapped on the red clay road, and he had walked the rest, the machine ticking and dragging at his side. By the time he reached the market, the sun was up, and the whole village had a reason to look at him and find him wanting. "Repairman," one trader called, mocking. "Repair yourself first." The stranger said nothing. He set the bicycle against a mud brick wall and crouched over the chain, turning the broken link in his fingers as if patience alone could mend iron. He did not beg. He did not explain. There was a stillness in him that the loud could not read. And because they could not read it, they decided it was nothing. Adaze had watched from her corner of the market, where she sold palm wine in calabashes and carried water for anyone who paid her a few coins. She was the cheapest girl in the square and the most despised, because she was an orphan with no mother to defend her name and no father to lift her station. The other traders used her and looked down on her in the same breath. She saw the man's cracked lips. She saw how the dust had settled in the lines of his face and how no one would even meet his eye. And something in her, some quiet thing her late mother had planted long ago, would not let her look away. So she lifted her water pot, the old cracked one mended with palm twine, and she carried it across the market while the whole square hissed. "Leave him, Adaze," Chinyere called from her bright stall of imported lace. Like calls to like. 2 beggars, 1 cup. The mocking women laughed. Mama Nkechi, the matriarch who ruled the square's gossip with her carved cane, spat into the dust. But Adaze knelt before the stranger and held out the pot, and her voice was gentle. "Drink, sir," she said. "The road is long and the sun has no mercy. This much I can give." The stranger looked up. For the first time that morning, someone had spoken to him as though he were a man and not a stain. He took the pot in both hands. He drank slowly, the way a thirsty man drinks when he is also a careful one. And when he had finished, he held the cracked clay between his palms a moment longer than he needed to, as if he were memorizing it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "What is your name?" "Adaze." "It means king's daughter," he said. She gave a tired smile. "My mother had high hopes. The world had other plans." He did not laugh. He looked at her as though her face were a thing worth reading carefully. And then he handed back the pot and asked, in the same low voice, where a poor man might find work mending things in Umokwe. That was how it began. Not with thunder, with water and a cracked clay pot, and a girl who would not let a stranger thirst. His name, he told the village, was Obi, a traveling repairman from the east, he said, with no people and no land, looking for honest work. He took a tiny mud brick room at the edge of the village from Deacon Okonkwo, an old widower with kind, crinkled eyes who asked few questions and charged little rent. He set up a stool and a box of tools under a flame tree near the market, and he mended what the village brought him: bicycles, lamps, the broken handle of a hoe, a radio that had not spoken in 2 years. He was good with his hands, better than any of them expected, and that only made them resent him more. For a poor man who can mend what the rich cannot shames their idleness, even as his worn sandals let them feel above him still. Chinyere despised him most of all. She was the daughter of a wealthy trader, betrothed by Mama Nkechi's, scheming to a chief's son in a far town. And she walked through the market each day in emerald lace as though the dust were beneath her feet. She had decided that Obi the repairman and Adaz the water girl were the 2 lowest creatures in Umuokwe, and she made a sport of saying so. "See how they sit," she told her circle of laughing women, loud enough to carry. "The beggar and the orphan. Perhaps they will marry and raise a family of paupers, and we will all bring them our broken pots." The women shrieked with laughter. Adais kept her eyes on her work and breathed slowly and said nothing. She had learned long ago that an orphan's only wealth was her dignity, and that the surest way to keep it was to refuse to trade insults with people who had nothing better to give. But Obi noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed which traders shortchanged the blind beggar at the gate and which gave him full measure. He noticed that a daisy always set aside a calabash of palm wine for the old leper who slept under the bridge, though she could barely feed herself. He noticed that when a child knocked over a basket of tomatoes and the owner raised a hand to strike him, it was the water girl who stepped between them and paid for the spoiled fruit out of her own thin purse. He noticed, and he wrote nothing down, because he carried his ledger in a quieter place than paper. At night, when the village had gone quiet and the only sound was the cry of insects in the dark, Obi sat alone in his small rented room by the light of a single oil lamp. He lifted a loose plank in the corner of the floor, his fingers finding the spot without looking, and from beneath it he drew a small cloth pouch. Inside the pouch was one coral bead. It was deep blood red, polished smooth by years of handling, and in the lamplight it seemed to hold a fire of its own. He turned it slowly between his fingers. To anyone who knew the old ways, that single bead said everything. It was the coral of kings, the coral that hung in long strands across the chests of crowned men in the palace of Umuokwe Kingdom, the coral his father had worn and his father before him. For Obi the repairman was not Obi the repairman at all. He was Obina, the crown prince of the Umuokwe royal house, heir to a kingdom of 7 villages and an estate so vast that its herdsmen did not know one another's names. He had taken off his coral beads and his lion cloth and his title, and he had folded them into a cedar chest in the keeping of an old and trusted royal messenger 2 villages away. He had pushed a deliberately broken bicycle into a market where no one knew his face, and he had let them all believe he was nothing. He had done it because he was tired in a way that gold cannot mend. Every woman his mother, the queen, had paraded before him had loved the coral and not the man. They had smiled at his wealth and yawned at his heart. And he had decided, against all the advice of his court, that he would go out into the world as a pauper and find out for himself whether kindness still existed for a man who had nothing to offer it. He put the bead back beneath the floor. He blew out the lamp. And in the dark, he thought of a thin girl with a cracked clay pot who had knelt in the mud for a stranger when the whole market told her not to. The next morning, he carried his tools as usual. But he carried something else now, too. A quiet certainty, growing day by day, that the answer he had crossed 2 villages to find was sitting in a corner of the market, selling palm wine for coins. The weeks turned, and Obina watched, and the village went on misjudging the man in their midst. A storm came one evening, hard and sudden, the kind that turns the red roads to rivers. Adaz was caught carrying water when the sky broke, and she slipped in the mud, and her cracked pot tumbled from her hands. It did not shatter. The old palm twine held it together. But the precious water spilled, and with it the few coins she had earned that day, scattered into the running mud. The mocking women, sheltering under Chinyere's wide stall awning, laughed at the sight of the orphan on her knees in the rain, scrabbling for coins she would never find. "Leave them, water girl," Chinyere called sweetly. "The mud has taken its own." But a pair of strong hands appeared beside hers in the wet earth. Obina had come out into the storm. He gathered the coins one by one, more than she had lost, pressing his own among them so she would not know the difference. And he lifted her cracked pot and set it upright and steadied her by the elbow until she found her feet. "You will catch your death," she protested, rain streaming down both their faces. "Go in, sir. You have no coat." "Neither do you," he said simply, and he walked her to the shelter of the flame tree and stood between her and the wind until the worst of it passed. Mama Nkechi watched them from her doorway and pursed her lips. "Two dogs in the rain," she muttered. "They deserve each other." She turned her back on the sight and yanked her door shut, harder than the wind required. She did not know she was speaking of a prince. She only knew that two people she had decided were beneath her were being kind to one another, and that the sight of it, for reasons she could not name, made her angry. A girl with nothing had something her cane could not reach, and it galled her like a stone in the sandal. Deacon Okonkwo, though, understood. The old widower had taken in the strange repairman and had begun, slowly, to see what others missed. He saw how the young man rose before dawn to pray. He saw the calm authority in him that no poor man should carry, the way he spoke to frightened children and angry market women with the same unhurried steadiness. And one evening, a quiet visitor came to the deacon's compound after dark. A dignified older man in a fine but travel-stained wrapper, who asked to speak with the deacon alone. The visitor was the royal messenger, the keeper of the cedar chest. He had come to assure himself his prince was well, and to leave the regalia in safer hands. By the light of the deacon's lamp, he opened the cedar chest a hand's breadth, and the old man saw what lay folded in red cloth. The coral beads, the gold-embroidered lion cloth, the regalia of a crown prince of Umaokwe. Deacon Okonkwo's breath caught. He knew that lion cloth. He had seen it once, long ago, on the old king at a festival, and he had never forgotten the weight of it. "Then the repairman in my back room," he began. "Speak it to no one," the messenger said gently. "He is testing the world, Deacon. He wishes to find a heart that loves the man and not the crown. If you have ever seen such a heart in this village, keep it safe. For the day is coming when all of this will be known." The deacon closed the chest with trembling hands and gave his word. And from that night, he watched the water girl Adaz with new and hopeful eyes, for he had seen exactly such a heart, kneeling in the mud with a cracked clay pot. If you have made it this far into Adaz's story, take a moment to subscribe, because what happens next is the part that has been waiting to be told. The day the coral beads came out, and the whole proud market learned who they had been laughing at. But the day of the coral beads had not yet come, and before it could, Mama Nkechi and Chinyere would do their worst. Mama Nkechi had not built her power in the market by ignoring threats, and she had begun to sense one in the water girl. It was not that Adaz had wealth or station. she had neither. It was that the orphan had something the matriarch could not control. People had started to speak well of her. A trader's wife had called her good. A child had run to her instead of to Mama Nkechi when he was hurt. And the old woman, who measured the world in fear and favor, decided the orphan had grown too tall and must be cut down. So she went to the elders with a complaint. Ades, she said, was selling palm wine without paying the market levy that every trader owed. It was a lie. The orphan had always paid, scraping the coins together though it left her hungry. But Mama Nkechi was believed, because the rich are always believed over the poor. And a date was set for Ades to answer the charge before the council or be driven from the market for good. When Ades heard, she did not weep where the others could see her. She carried her cracked pot to the river at dusk and sat on the bank where her mother was buried. And only there, in the failing light, did she let the tears come. "I have done nothing, Mama," she whispered to the grave. "I have only tried to be good in a place that punishes goodness. Was that your high hope for me? To be cast out for paying a levy I already paid?" The river ran on, dark and patient, and gave no answer. But the silence of the river was not an empty silence. It was the silence of a thing that has seen many griefs come down to its banks, and many of them carried away again by the morning. Ades pressed her palm flat against the cool earth of the grave and breathed, slow and steady. And she made herself remember every gentle thing her mother had ever told her, holding them up one by one in the dark, like beads on a string, until the weeping eased and a strange small steadiness settled over her in its place. A footstep sounded on the bank behind her. It was Obinna, who had followed at a distance when he saw her leave the market with grief in her shoulders. He sat down a respectful space away and did not crowd her sorrow. "They have lied about me to the elders," she told him, because somehow he had become the one person she could tell. "I will lose my place. I will lose even this poor corner of the world." "And if you lost it?" he asked quietly. "What would you do?" "Begin again," she said. "Somewhere, with nothing. It is what I have always done." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "My mother used to say that God sees the orphan when no one else will. I have to believe that, or I have nothing at all." Obinna was silent for a long moment, watching the river. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "He sees you," he said. "I am certain of it, more certain than you know." She looked at him then, this poor stranger who spoke sometimes like a man who had read deep books, and she felt the smallest warmth in the cold of her fear. "You are kind to me, Obi," she said. "Why? You have your own troubles. You have less than I do." He almost told her the truth that night. The words were on his lips, that he was no repairman, that he had a kingdom waiting and the power to crush Mama Nkechi's lie with a single word. But he held it back because he wanted just once to be helped and not feared, to be loved before he was known. So he only said, "Because once, when I had nothing, you gave me water." A man does not forget the first hand that was kind to him. The day of the council came. The square was packed, for everyone loves a trial. And Mama Nkechi stood in her richest purple wrapper, with her cane like a scepter, certain of her victory. Chinyere watched from the front with a small, cruel smile, already savoring the orphan's disgrace. Ades came forward in her faded blue, her chin level, her cracked pot left at home for once. She did not shout. She laid out her case plainly, the dates she had paid, the trader who had stood beside her each time, the coins counted into the levy-keeper's hand. But the levy-keeper was Mama Nkechi's nephew, and he swore he had no record, and the elders, swayed by wealth and noise, began to nod toward the matriarch. It was slipping away. The levee-keeper folded his arms and let a small smile show. The eldest of the council reached for his staff to pronounce the orphan cast out. And then a voice rose from the back of the crowd. She paid. The square turned. It was Deacon Okonkwo, leaning on his staff, his worn Bible in his hand. And beside him stood the poor repairman, Obi. I keep my own small book, the deacon said, as an old man does. And this young man here keeps the levee-keeper's own discarded slips, for he mends and saves what others throw away. Between us, we have every date the woman is accused of skipping, with her coins marked received. He held up a fistful of crumpled paper. She paid. The charge is false. The question the elders should be asking is not why a poor orphan owes a levy. It is why a rich matriarch needed to lie to be rid of her. A murmur went through the crowd, and it swung, all at once, against the one who had overreached. Mama Nkechi's face went gray with fury. The elders, embarrassed, dismissed the charge. Adaeze was not cast out. But the matriarch did not forget, and neither did Chinyere. And from that hour, the two of them set their hatred not only on the orphan, but on the meddling repairmen who had shamed them in front of the whole village. You think you have won, Chinyere hissed at Adaeze as the crowd dispersed. You and your beggar. Enjoy your little corner. In 1 month I marry into a great house, and I will come back through this market in a fine car, and you will still be here in the mud with your cracked pot, exactly where God put you. Then I will wish you joy from the mud, Adaeze answered, with a calm that enraged the proud girl more than any insult could have. And I will still be glad I never had to buy my place by stepping on someone smaller than me. Chinyere had no answer for that, so she turned on her heel and swept away, and the matriarch followed, and the war was set. The month passed quickly, and the day of Chinyere's great betrothal feast arrived. Mama Nkechi had spared nothing. She had turned the whole market square into a hall of celebration, with canopies of bright cloth and long tables groaning under jollof rice and roasted goat and crates of imported drink. The matriarch had decreed that the feast would be the day Umuokwe remembered who mattered and who did not. Chinyere would be presented to the village in her finest. The chief's son's family would come to confirm the match, and the whole market would bow to the rising house, while the poor watched from the edges and learned their place. Adaeze had not been invited, of course, but the matriarch, in a final flourish of cruelty, sent word that the orphan and the repairman were to attend as servers, to carry water and clear plates for the very people who despised them, so that everyone might see exactly where she had placed them. Obinna agreed at once, to Adaeze's surprise. "Let us go," he said, and there was something in his eyes she could not read. A banked fire, a patience that was almost terrible. "Let us carry the water. I would not miss this feast for anything in the world." So on the day, the orphan in her faded blue and the repairman in his ash-gray shirt moved among the canopies with trays and jugs while the village feasted. Chinyere sat enthroned at the high table in a gown of gold and emerald, glittering with jewelry. And she made certain to call Adaeze over again and again for the smallest things, to fill her cup, to fan her, to fetch a dropped napkin, savoring each small humiliation in front of the watching crowd. "More wine, water girl," she said sweetly. And then, to her laughing women, "Is she not useful? Every great house needs a creature like this. Perhaps when I am married, I will take her with me, to remind me each morning how far above her God has placed me." The mocking women shrieked. Mama Nkechi struck her cane and beamed. And Adeze poured the wine with steady hands and said nothing, breathing slowly, holding her dignity the way a drowning woman holds the last plank of a wreck. The chief's son's family arrived. The drums rose. Mama Nkechi stood to make her grand speech about the union of great houses, about blood and worth and the proper order of the world. And that was the moment the world chose to turn. A sound came from beyond the square. At first it was only a low rumble under the drums, easy to miss. Then it grew, and the drums faltered, and the dancers stopped, and every head turned toward the road. A convoy was coming. A line of gleaming white luxury vehicles, Lexus and Prado, their engines deep and smooth, their paint throwing back the sun, more wealth rolling into Umuokwe in a single minute than the village had seen in a generation. The cars stopped at the edge of the feast. Uniformed men stepped out and stood at attention. The crowd went silent, certain that some great king or governor had come, scrambling in their minds to guess who. Then the door of the lead vehicle opened, and an elderly man in the rich robes of a palace steward stepped down. His name was Nwankwo, and he had served the royal house of Umuokwe Kingdom for 40 years. He surveyed the gaudy feast, the canopies, the high table, the matriarch frozen mid-speech with her cane in the air. And his gaze moved past all of it, past the gold and the emerald and the glittering bride, to a poor repairman in an ash-gray shirt standing among the servers with a water jug in his hand. The steward crossed the square. The crowd parted before him without understanding why. He stopped before the repairman, and then, in front of the whole village, the dignified old man lowered himself to his knees in the dust. "Your Highness," Nwankwo said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent square. "Forgive us. The queen, your mother, grows anxious. The kingdom has waited long enough. It is time to come home." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. "Highness?" Mama Nkechi's voice cracked the silence, thin and disbelieving. "What, Highness? That is a beggar. That is a repairman who sleeps in Okonkwo's back room." The steward rose and turned to her, and his old eyes were cold. "That," he said, "is Obinna, son of the late king, crown prince of the Umuokwe royal house, heir to the 7 villages and the royal estate. He went out among you as a poor man of his own will. And it seems," he added, letting his gaze sweep across the feast, across Chinyere and her women and the matriarch with her useless cane, "that he has learned a great deal about who you are." The men from the convoy lifted a carved cedar chest from the lead vehicle and bore it to the prince. They opened it before the village, and from the folds of red cloth they lifted out the regalia. The gold-embroidered red Isiagu lion cloth, the long strands of deep red coral beads, the coral cap of a crowned heir. They draped the lion cloth across Obinna's shoulders. They hung the coral beads at his chest. They set the coral cap upon his head. And the poor repairman, the whole proud market, had laughed at, scorned, used, and humiliated, stood transformed before them into exactly what he had always been. A prince, calm and powerful, the banked fire in his eyes, now plain for all to see. The cracked clay pot of the morning was forgotten. The choral of kings had come out, and nothing in Umuokwe would ever be the same. Chinyere was the first to move. She came down from the high table in a rush of gold and emerald, her face transformed, all her contempt melted into honey. She had spent her whole life being taught that a great match was the only prize worth winning. And here, impossibly, was the greatest match in all the land, standing in the very square she ruled. "Your Highness," she breathed, sinking into a deep bow, her lashes lowered. "Forgive these foolish people. They did not know you. But I always sensed there was something noble in you, something above the common. Surely a prince needs a wife who understands greatness. I am betrothed, it is true, but a betrothal can be set aside for a crown. Be silent, Obina said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The two words fell like a gate closing, and Chinyere's pretty speech died in her throat. I stood in this square for 3 months, the prince said, and now his voice carried to every ear, level and cold and clear. I carried a broken bicycle. I mended your lamps and your radios for coins. I went hungry some days. And I watched. I watched all of you. I saw who you are when you believe a man is beneath you, because that, and not the feast you put on for the powerful, is the true measure of a soul. He turned slowly, letting his gaze move across the village. I watched a matriarch lie to the elders to drive a hungry orphan from her only corner of the market. I watched a betrothed bride make a servant of a girl whose only crime was poverty and laugh while she did it. I watched a whole market mock a stranger because his sandals were worn. And not one of you, not one, offered him so much as water. The square was utterly still. Mama Nkechi had sunk onto a bench, her cane fallen from her hand, her face the color of ash. Chinyere stood frozen, her honeyed smile collapsing into horror as she understood, at last, what the prince had seen. Not one of you, Obina repeated. And then, softly, except one. He began to walk. The crowd parted before him, and he walked the length of the square, past the high table, past the proud and the powerful, to the very edge of the feast, where the servers stood. He stopped before a thin girl in a faded blue wrapper, who was staring at him with her hand pressed to her mouth and tears standing in her large, dark eyes. You, Obina said gently, and all the coldness left his voice. You knelt in the mud and gave a beggar water when the whole world told you not to. You shared your bread with a leper. You stepped between a child and a blow. You paid a levy that left you hungry and never once complained. You were lied about, used, laughed at, and made to serve at the feast of the woman who tried to destroy you. And through all of it, you did not trade your dignity for revenge, and you did not let them turn your heart hard. Adeze could not speak. She shook her head slowly, as if to wake from a dream. The day you gave me water, he said, you did not know I was a prince. You could not have known. You were kind to a man who had nothing to give you. That is the rarest thing in this world, and I crossed 2 villages and wore out a pair of sandals to find it. I have found it in you. He reached up and lifted one long strand of deep red coral beads from his own chest. And there, before the whole silenced village, the crown prince of Umuokwe draped the coral of kings around the neck of the orphan water girl. Adeze, he said, king's daughter, your mother named you true. Will you have me? Not the prince, but the man you were kind to when he was poor? Will you be my wife? The square erupted, not in mockery now, in astonishment, and then, here and there, in joy. For even a hard village loves to see the lowly lifted up when the lifting is undeniable. Deacon Okonkwo wept openly, then lifted his worn Bible toward heaven. The traders who had despised Adeze stared at the coral beads at her throat and felt the ground of their certainties shift beneath them. Adeze looked at the coral beads and at the kind face above them that she had known as a poor stranger. And she understood that the man had not changed at all, only her knowledge of him. He was the same gentle soul who had drunk slowly from her cracked pot and steadied her elbow in the storm. The coral did not make him kind. He had been kind when he had nothing. That was why she could answer. I do not want the crown, she said, her voice trembling but clear, so that all could hear. I never wanted any of this. I only wanted to be good in a world that made it hard. But the man who gathered my coins in the rain and never let me thirst, yes, yes, I will have the man." He took her hands. The coral beads gleamed at both their throats now, his and hers, the same blood-red fire. And the village that had laughed at them both that loud, bright morning bowed its head before them. For Mama Nkechi and Chinyere, there was no place left to stand. The chief's son's family, appalled at the cruelty the prince had laid bare, withdrew from the betrothal before the sun had set. No great house wished to bind itself to a girl publicly named for her contempt of the poor. Mama Nkechi's power in the market, built on fear and favor, drained away in a single afternoon. For no one fears a matriarch the prince himself has shamed. The two proud women gathered their ruined finery and slipped away through the dispersing crowd, unhumiliated by any hand but their own pride, which had done all the work that justice required. The wedding of the crown prince of Umuokwe to the orphan water girl was held when the rains had passed and the roads were dry and gold with dust. The whole kingdom came. 7 villages emptied themselves toward the royal estate, and the great gates that Adais had never even imagined stood open to receive her. She who had slept in a one-room mud house and washed in a cracked clay pot was bathed and braided by the queen's own women. Her hair worked into elegant coral-beaded braids, gold at her ears and wrists. And when she came down the grand staircase of the palace to meet her prince, the village that had once laughed did not know her, for she descended in a shimmering red sequin gown that caught the light of 100 lamps, with the deep red coral bead bridal set of the royal house at her throat, a queen in every line of her, radiant and serene. Yet when she found Obinna waiting at the foot of the stairs in his full gold-embroidered red Isiagu regalia and coral cap, she went down to him not as a stranger to all this splendor, but as the girl who had once held out a cracked pot to him in the dust. The same level chin, the same steady eyes, the gown borrowed and the soul her own. In the traditional rites, before the assembled kingdom, Obinna took the long strands of royal coral and wound them about Adaiz's neck and wrists with his own hands, binding her to him and to the crown. And the drums and the voices rose until the very rafters of the palace rang. The choral of kings, which had come out of the cedar chest to unmask a prince, now bound a queen who had earned it, not by birth or scheming, but by a single act of mercy on a hard, bright morning in a market that despised her. But the truest measure of the new queen was seen not at the wedding, but in the days that followed. For the glow-up that mattered most was not the gown. Adaizi did not forget where she had stood. With the prince's blessing and the resources of the crown now in her gentle hands, she turned at once to the poor she had once been counted among. She had the old leper who slept under the bridge brought to the estate's physicians and given a clean bed and care for the rest of his days. She found the blind beggar from the market gate and settled a pension on him so that he need never again hold out his hand. She built, at the edge of Umuokwe, a house of refuge for orphans, for girls with no mother to defend their name and no father to lift their station. And she funded it from her own household, and she visited it herself in plain wrappers, so the children would not be afraid of her. She kept the cracked clay water pot, when the palace stewards would have thrown the poor mended thing away. She stopped them, and she set it on a shelf in her own chambers where she could see it. And she kept it filled always with fresh flowers. It was the only thing she had carried out of her old life, and she would not be parted from it. For it reminded her each morning of the girl she had been and the goodness she had refused to surrender. Deacon Okonkwo, the kind old widower who had sheltered the prince and spoken up for the orphan when no one else would, was made a steward of the new house of refuge and given an honored place at the royal table. He often said, with tears in his crinkled eyes, that he had only ever done the small thing in front of him, and that God had made it large. And the prince, who had crossed 2 villages disguised as a pauper to find a heart that loved the man and not the crown, looked on his queen as she knelt in plain cloth among the orphan children she had rescued. And he knew, beyond any doubt, that gold could buy or scheming could win, that he had found exactly what he had gone out to seek. Word of the wedding spread far beyond the 7 villages. It traveled the roads and the rivers and the long ways that stories travel, carried by traders and travelers and by the diaspora children of Umuokwe scattered across the wide world. In the markets of the south and the cities of the north, across the sea in the cold countries and the warm islands. Wherever the sons and daughters of that land had gone, the tale of the prince and the water girl was told, of how kindness shown to a stranger had lifted an orphan to a throne, and how pride had brought the mighty low. And those who told it added always the same words their mothers had taught them, that the God of the orphan sees in secret, and that what the proud despise, he delights to lift up. The palace was a strange country to Adès in those first weeks, and she moved through it with wonder, and with care, and with a quiet refusal to lose herself in it. There were rooms in the royal estate she did not enter for a month because their grandeur frightened her. There were servants who did not know how to treat a queen, who thanked them by name and asked after their mothers. There was a vast carved bed. She could not sleep in it first, so accustomed was she to a mat on a mud floor. And more than once in those early nights, Obinna found her curled in a chair by the window instead, and he did not laugh at her. For he remembered his own first nights in a poor man's room, and how strange the hardness of that floor had been to a prince. "You will get used to it," he told her gently, sitting with her in the dark. "Not the gold. The gold does not matter, but the not being afraid. That takes longest of all. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake," she admitted, "that the prince meant some other water girl, that I must go back to the market and the cracked pot and the people who knew my place." She looked at him. 3 months you sat under that flame tree and let them despise you. How did you bear it, knowing who you were the whole time? He was quiet, considering the question with the seriousness he gave to everything. "Because I learned more in those 3 months than in all my years in this palace," he said at last. "A man surrounded by people who fear him never learns the truth about anything. They tell him what he wishes to hear. But a poor repairman that no one fears, him they let see everything. I saw the kingdom as it truly is. I saw the cruelty the powerful hide behind their feasts. And I saw you, who had no reason to be kind and were kind anyway. I would not trade those 3 hard months for 10 easy years. They taught me how to be a king worth following." Adaize understood that, for she had learned the same lesson from the other side of it. The market had taught her that dignity is not given by station, but kept by the soul, and she carried that knowledge up the palace stairs and into the throne room, and would not set it down. She insisted on grinding her own pepper some mornings, to the despair of the cooks, because the work kept her hands honest. She walked out among the market women in plain wrappers, and sat on their low stools and drank their palm wine and laughed with them. And they found, to their amazement, that the queen was still Adès, that the coral at her throat had not closed her heart but opened her hands. The diaspora children who came home to visit the kingdom spoke of it most of all. They had grown up in far places, hearing their grandmothers warn that wealth changes people, that the lifted up forget the low. And here was a queen who proved the warning need not be true, who had every gown and every jewel and every reason to look down, and who looked instead for the next hungry child. the next lonely widow, the next stranger she might kneel for. Hope without losing herself, the watching world called it. The glow-up that did not cost a soul. There was one more thing the new queen did that the village spoke of for years, and it surprised them most of all. A season after the wedding, when the harmattan winds had come and the markets were thin, a thin figure was seen at the gate of the royal estate, asking after the queen. It was Mama Nkechi. The matriarch's wealth had withered with her standing. Her nephew had abandoned her, her circle had scattered, and pride makes a cold companion when the favors stop. She had come, she said, not to beg, but she would not say what she had come for, and the guards were of a mind to send her away. But a daisy heard, and a daisy came down to the gate herself in a plain wrapper, with the harmattan dust gold in the air around her. The old woman who had lied to drive her from the market now stood before her shrunken and gray, unable to meet her eyes. "You have every right," Mama Nkechi said hoarsely, "to set the dogs on me. I would, if I were you." Adaize was quiet for a long moment. She thought of the riverbank where she had wept on her mother's grave, certain she would be cast out on this woman's lie. She thought of the feast where she had been made a servant. The memory still had teeth. "I will not pretend you were kind to me," the queen said at last. "You were cruel, and the cruelty was real, and I will not call it anything else. But my mother taught me that we are not made clean by the wrongs done to us, only by what we choose to do after. I will not set the dogs on you. There is bread in the kitchens. There is work at the house of refuge for any hand willing to be gentle now, even one that was hard before. Whether you take it is between you and God. But you will not starve at my gate." It was not the revenge the village had hoped to hear about, and it was greater than revenge. For it left the old woman with nothing to nurse but the memory of her own cruelty set against an undeserved mercy, which is a heavier sentence than any beating. Mama Nkechi wept then, the first true tears of her life, and whether she ever truly changed, only heaven knows. But she ate the bread, and she carried water at the house of refuge with the same hands that had once struck a cane on a basket, and she did not lie again. As for Chinyere, she was not seen in Umuokwe again. Her broken betrothal had shamed her family, and she went away to a distant town to begin again where no one knew the story. And the prince did not pursue her, and the queen did not speak of her. She had her gold still and her mirror, and the long, quiet evenings in which to remember whose face she had laughed at. And that was punishment enough. The kingdom settled into its joy. Obinna, now formally crowned beside his aging mother, ruled the 7 villages with the same unhurried steadiness he had shown mending lamps under the flame tree. And the people found, to their wonder, that a king who had once been poor governs differently than one who has never gone hungry. He remembered the weight of a broken bicycle. He remembered what it was to be unseen. He built roads to the far villages and wells in the dry places and schools for the children of traders. And he listened, in his own court, to the smallest and the poorest first. And at his side, the queen who had been a water girl became, in time, the most beloved figure in all the land. Not for her gowns, though they were splendid, and not for her crown, though it was real, but because she still knew the names of the market women, still asked after their children, still kept a cracked clay pot of flowers on a shelf in the palace, and was not ashamed of it. The diaspora children who came home to visit would find her on a low stool among the traders, plain wrapper, sleeves pushed back, and they would go away again, telling their own children that they had seen it with their own eyes. A queen who had not forgotten the mud. If you are watching this story from one of those far places tonight, from the south or the north, from across the sea, from a cold city or a warm island where the people of this land have scattered. Then leave a word below and say where you are watching from, so that all of us gathered here for Adai's can see how wide her family has grown. For that is what she would have wanted. Not to be admired from a distance, but to know that somewhere, someone watching remembered that kindness is never wasted, and that no act of mercy is ever as small as it looks. The story of the prince and the water girl had one more evening left to give, and it was the gentlest of all. It was the close of a long and good day at the royal estate, a year and more after the wedding. The harvest had come in full. The house of refuge was loud with the laughter of children who had been hungry once and were hungry no longer. And as the sun went down over the 7 villages, the sky turned the deep gold and bruised crimson of a Nollywood evening. The colors of coral and flame and the first stars came out one by one over the land. Adai stood at the high window of her chambers and watched the light fade. She had taken off the gold of the day. She wore a simple wrapper now, the kind she had always worn, and her hair was loose, and in the soft last light she might almost have been the water girl again. But for the peace in her face, which the girl had never been allowed. Obinna came and stood beside her, the king who had been a repairman, and together they watched the dusk settle over the kingdom they served. He had set aside his coral cap. The long strands of royal coral still hung at his chest, catching the last of the light, the same deep red as the bead he had once turned alone beneath a poor man's floor. "You are thinking of the market," he said. It was not a question. He had learned to read her the way she had once read a thirsty stranger's face. "I am thinking of the morning you came," she said softly. "How you stood there with your broken chain, and how the whole square laughed, and how something in me would not let you thirst." She smiled. "I thought I was giving water to a poor man. I did not know I was giving it to my whole life." "You gave it without knowing," he said. "That is why it counted. If you had known I was a prince, the water would have been an investment. Because you did not know, it was love. The kingdom is yours by right, Adais. Because you earned it on the one morning it could not be bought." She reached out then to the shelf beside the window, where the old cracked clay water pot stood in the gathering dark, mended with palm twine, filled now with white flowers that glowed faintly in the dusk. She lifted it down, the poor thing that had carried her through every hard year, and she held it between her palms, the way she had once held it out to a stranger on the worst morning of her life. "My mother named me King's daughter," she said, turning the worn pot in her hands. "The world told me she was a foolish woman with foolish hopes. But she was not foolish. She only saw further than the world could see. She set the pot down gently beside the coral regalia that lay across the chest by the window. The humble clay and the royal coral resting side by side, the cracked pot and the crown of kings, the two halves of the story finally at peace with one another in the last of the light. "You were 18, the year your mother died," Obinna said quietly. "Alone in the world at 18, with a cracked pot and a market that despised you. And here you stand." "Here I stand," she agreed. And she breathed out slowly, and the breath was steady, and the fear that had lived in her for so many years was simply gone. They were not alone in their joy that evening, for the family the story had gathered came in as the lamps were lit. Deacon Okonkwo came, leaning on his staff, his worn Bible under his arm. The kind old widower who had sheltered a prince and defended an orphan and asked nothing for himself. The steward Nwankwo came, who had knelt in the dust of the market square and called a beggar by his true name. The Queen Mother came, leaning on her son's arm, who had feared her boy would never find a heart that loved him true, and had lived to see it found. They gathered at the high window as the stars thickened. This small, unlikely family that no blood had made and no scheming could have arranged. Bound together only by the one thing that had bound them from the start. That each of them, in their own way, had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. Deacon Okonkwo looked out at the darkening land and the lights coming on in the far villages, and he opened his worn Bible, though it was nearly too dark to read. And he spoke from memory the words he had carried all his life. "He raises the poor from the dust," the old man said, his voice trembling with joy, "and lifts the needy from the ash heap to seat them with princes. The God of the orphan does not forget. He never forgot her. He only waited until the whole world was watching to show what he had always seen. And Adez, the queen who had been a water girl, stood with the coral of kings at her throat and the cracked clay pot at her hand and her gentle husband at her side. And she understood at last what her mother had meant and what the long, hard years had been for, and why no act of mercy is ever truly lost. She had given away a cup of water on the worst morning of her life. And heaven had given her back a kingdom, a good man, a family, and a name that meant exactly what her mother had hoped it would. Outside, the last light died in the west, and the stars came fully out over the 7 villages of Umuokwe. And somewhere in the dark, a market square stood empty and waiting for the morning. The corner where a poor girl had once knelt in the mud, now worn smooth by the feet of all who came to remember. Somewhere, a matriarch sat alone with a fallen cane and a name no one feared. And on a worn shelf in a palace, a cracked clay pot held white flowers in the dark. The cup of water that a whole kingdom had come to remember.